Welcome back to The Craft, where we explore what we're learning about the creative process. I'm Carter, and I'm here with my good friend Colby. And today, we are going to do a book review for Angela Duckworth's Grit, The Power of Passion and Perseverance. And this is really going to be kind of catered towards, I think, creative grit. What is creative grit? Can we describe it? Colby's going to walk us through the main ideas of the book. I haven't read the book, so we're going to look to him for kind of the bones of the argument. So, Colby, I'm going to hand it over to you, main ideas, kind of set up the framework.
I'm excited. I've been wanting to talk about this with you for a bit, and it'll be fun. So, the book is really a story. It's two things. One, it's a great nonfiction just studying what is the science of success, and is asking this question: is success a product of talent, of skill, of hard work and just grinding it out, luck, or the cards you're dealt, whatever that may be? Or is it this thing called grit? And what is grit? And it's kind of this narrative of the author, Angela Duckworth, how she's been studying this thing for 5, 10, 15, 20, whatever, however many years it is, and carved out an interesting career path around these different scholarly ideas. And so it sort of draws on her narrative of learning about grit, exploring this idea, and becoming grittier herself, and learning that you can become more gritty over time. So that's kind of my quick summary of the book, is really just a study of what makes people successful, but it really hones in on this idea. The central thesis of the book is that it's not just about being super talented. It's not just about working super hard, but there's actually a meeting place between some talent, but also hard work. I don't want to get ahead of myself, actually. Let's just stop there.
Yeah. Well, I think that's a perfect, overview. I take it that the ingredient that she ends up kind of focusing on, what's the kind of, I won't say secret, but what's the key prerequisite maybe to success is grit. So then how does she define grit? Is this just perseverance, or is there something different than a stick-to-itness? Or maybe you could just kind of speak for a minute here about how Duckworth goes on to define grit as a concept.
Okay, so the definition's actually in the subtitle, really. She talks about grit being passion and perseverance for long-term goals. That's essentially all it is. So passion being not just something that I was born with this, but it could be something that's cultivated over time. I think that's a really interesting idea. But then the perseverance is not simply never giving up no matter what, even if the world's against you and saying this is a terrible idea, but rather you have a big goal that you're going towards, and the small details can change. And so you can say no to things and fall off and drop some balls and not juggle everything perfectly. That's okay. But it's about, I have this compass in this direction, and am I sticking with that over the long term? So those are some of the big ideas that stuck out. I want to talk more about that goals thing later, but yeah, that's how she defines it.
That's really helpful, because I could see both of those, if we take passion and perseverance as the two converging vectors, or however you want to say it. I could see each of them being insufficient on their own, because you've got the passion project, right, that you're casually doing, that you never really stick to, and you want to be a painter, you want to be a writer, but you don't really write, but you don't really paint, and you're passionate about it, but it doesn't have that accompanying perseverance, right? And I think the same way, in maybe a little less intuitive manner, perseverance is kind of like that as well, in that if it's just perseverance, you could get kind of hard-headed or unnecessarily fixated on something where the passion might be gone, and it may just be drudgery. So you've got the issue of drudgery, but you may even also have the issue of you lose the vision. If it's just about perseverance and doing it, you kind of lose that lightning in a jar that you've mentioned before. I don't know who that was, but you lose that thing which you're persevering to do in the first place. And so perseverance in that way, I think, too, is insufficient. And so you kind of have to have them fuse in a way. I think that's a really helpful framework.
Yeah, if I had to put this podcast into a category, I would call this episode a sustain episode for sure, because it really is about thinking long term, having a bigger vision for your life and your work, and the perseverance piece, I think, is probably the biggest idea about grit, because you don't have to be, I don't think that you have to be the most passionate person about writing something in order to persevere. You need to have a lot, maybe I'm going to contradict myself. You do need a lot of passion in order to get through the storms and get through the valleys and the deserts and the dry seasons and things like that in your career or your craft or whatever it is that you're passionate about. But you don't have to be the most passionate about that, the greatest. I mean, actually, I think the biggest myth that she's trying to dispel with this book is that you don't have to be the greatest. Like, that's maybe where I should focus. Like, we're fed this belief that it's all just talent. And then what happens is there's a misattribution. So you see the Olympic athlete do this incredible feat and you say, wow, they're so talented. But what you basically just said is, well, only talented people can do that, and it's all attributed to talent, when that's not fair. It's not the only cause of those effects. And you can be extremely talented and wither that talent away is one situation. You could be not as talented, but much harder worker than that other person, and then go further. And you also could be super talented and super hardworking, but then just stop after however many months or years or whatever it is. And then someone else could just keep going, and that is going to lead to, more success because they're just in the game essentially. And so I think that the big myth and the big idea that she wanted to see, like, is this really true? Is it really all about talent?
That makes total sense. And here's the thing that I think is what's deceptive about that myth is that to some degree, there's a element of truth to that. So I would be a much better basketball player if I was 6'10" and 250, but I'm not. Right? So there's limitations, right, that specific talents give parameters to. And so I think that's the little bit of truth. But you're totally right. What we do, though, is that we use that as an excuse to kind of, I think, build up a wall for ourselves. You're like, oh, they have talent. I do not have whatever X factor that is. And so I can almost kind of let myself off the hook in a way of I just can't do it. I mean, I don't have that whatever X factor, whatever that might be. And so therefore I'm disqualified from participating in that thing I admire. And so I think that seems exactly what she's getting after, of that you don't let this become a roadblock for your development of just trying to, in a defeatist way, being like, oh, I'm just not talented enough.
So I think something to back up and say that's worth noting is that this book was very heavily researched and scientifically backed, and that was her lens, was to be as objective as she could and data backed as she could be. It's not perfect, of course, but I think it's really not a book of touchy-feely, but very like, here's the stories, here's the data, let me lay it out for you. But it's also not just super dry and academic. So just a plug for the book. It's really well written, and it's also very well researched. So it gives me a lot of confidence in the ideas. And she tackles all those little nuances that you just described very well. But going back to the main subject at hand here, I think that she drills down on this a little deeper. She actually spent a lot of time developing these two formulas. The first one is talent times effort equals skill. And then the second one is that skill times effort equals achievement. And the result of that is that effort counts twice.
Ooh.
So you kind of use those two formulas together. And her idea is that if effort is a variable in both equations, then it's more meaningful, it's more valuable. And it ties directly into grit. So talent, so let's say my talent is at a 1 and my effort is at a 9. I still might not go as far as someone who's got a 9 talent and a 9 effort, but I could go further than someone who has an 8 talent and a 1 effort, And so it's not a perfect mathematical thing, but I think it's a powerful idea of just how do you get skill? You have whatever talents you have, that is maybe the uncontrollable in this equation, but then the effort is the controllable. And then from that you get skill. And then once you have whatever skill you have, then you reapply. You just keep putting in the hours, putting in the effort and practice. And that's where you get your achievements from.
Dude, I love that. I like that for so many different reasons. One, I think it's helpful in thinking about how maybe you don't have the talent. Well, guess what? That's not even the product of the first equation. That's just a way to get your skill. And so where you end up with the skill, maybe you're going to need a whole lot more effort if you don't have as much talent. But, if you've got, all right, let's just, we're getting into math here. If you've got, let's just
Public
say,
math.
if you've got a 2 in talent, we'll go very simple, and you give it a 4 in effort, right? You're going to end up with 8. So maybe you had to give a lot more effort than someone who had a 4 in talent and a 2 in effort, right? They got to give half as much effort as you did to get to the same skill. But here's the cool thing. Guess what you guys bring to the next equation? The same exact skill, which I love that because I think there's a lot of truth in that because it's not just about talent and effort. I like how this is staged and that then you have to apply that skill, which that's a whole nother issue at hand. And another thing so I really like how they're separated. I think having a dual approach in that way is very accurate to the actual real life scenarios. But 2, what I really like, or I don't know if I really like it or it came to my mind, I think a lot of times we try to cut these down to 1 and we say effort times talent should equal achievement. And we're trying to cut out a big part of the process. So if we think about this like creatively, I think sometimes it's like, oh, you got talent, you need to work hard, and then there's achievement. But that's kind of a abridged version of the process, that there's actually this time where you need to develop skill. And that's an equation in itself, and it can be frustrating if you're throwing effort at talent and you're expecting achievement, but achievements, you're not in that equation yet.
Yeah, that's really well said. It's like you're looking for the outcome of a later stage of development in a way. It really is interesting. It's like, man, I'm making all this stuff. Why isn't it blowing up? Or why isn't it making money? Or why isn't it hitting these achievements or in a gallery or whatever it may be? Maybe it's because this is time for you to develop that. It's sort of developing your prerequisite, which maybe doesn't feel as great still, but it is helpful to separate, okay, what am I working on right now? Am I just developing and honing my skill? Or am I using my skills to, achieve something? I don't know. I mean, it's not like a clean break, though. It's not like you do this for 2 years and then you get your badge and you get to go on to achievement mode. But I do think that it's helpful to separate these two things out and say, okay, there's different stages of life and different stages of work in my career. Maybe I shift back and forth.
Yeah, I think that's good. And I love that within that scenario, Duckworth has identified effort as being the double factor. And it's also the thing that you can directly control. This even goes back to, in some ways, Stoic thought, in that what do you have control of? Your response to the environment around you. And that's kind of what we have with effort, right? The effort you can show up with, regardless of the tools in the toolbox, the skill, or the talent. And as you're developing the skill, it's hard to quantify. Am I You know what I mean? Like if I was to say, like, what skills do you have as a music producer? Like that's such a vague, strange question of like, what are you really skillful at? And immediately you would start saying, well, I'm pretty good at this. I don't know if I call myself skillful at, I mean, at least that's how I would answer that question. If someone's like, yeah, you'd have a couple ideas of what your skills were, but it's hard to like say, am I at skill level 7 or am I skill level 3? Compared to what? But the effort, that's something that's so practical. All right, where to next in the book?
So good. Yeah. And the other thing I'll say on that note of these equations is, of course, there's an equation of just your life circumstances. And she doesn't really talk about that much. But of course, there's, for some might be luck or whatever they would call it. For me, it's faith in God. But I think that is obviously just a factor that's
really sharp
from the equation. At least as a side note for me personally, is like, it's not only even just time and place. And Bill Gates has talked a lot about, how it was like, if I didn't go to this school, I didn't have access to a computer, I wouldn't do computer programming, and I wouldn't make Microsoft. And it's just one thing leads to the next to the next. And I think that's a piece it's not really worth going into because that's out of the scope of this book. And I think that's why she left it out kind of reasonably, but just something to mention.
Yeah.
Maybe she goes into it and I don't recall, but that's a side note. But yeah, there's so many other things. I wanted to share just the 4 like pillar pieces of the book. And the big idea here is that it's like the second of 3 sections of the book. It's called something like Grit Can Be Developed. And it's good news. It's like, okay, you're not just either super gritty, hardcore, gonna crush it,
Jocko,
or you super, exactly, or just constantly giving up on everything you start. It is a spectrum, but it's not a spectrum where you're stuck and whatever you were on day 1, that's where you're going to be on day 1,000. So that was in and of itself encouraging to me. Just this idea that it's something that can be cultivated because everyone likes comfort. Everyone likes to be lazy. Everyone wants to take the easy path, of course, but there's ways to change and grow and develop. And so the 4 chapters that she breaks into, the first one, she has like a chart on how to develop or how to assess your grittiness. So you could go online, look that up, and kind of do a test to see how gritty you are, which is interesting in and of itself. But then the next sections are interest. That's about cultivating your passions, practicing. And she really dives into the idea of deliberate practice. So taking like the thing you're the weakest at and really working out that muscle. And that is the difference between doing, the way they'd say it is doing the same job 20 years in a row, or so having 20 years of the same experience one time over, or 20 true years of building experience that compound on each other. And then the 3rd chapter in that section is purpose, connecting your work to society, to people, the world, how it impacts others, gives you more fuel for that perseverance and passion. And then the 4th section is hope, which is really just having a growth mindset and believing that I can actually get better at this thing. Like I might stink at it right now and I can be better tomorrow. And that's she talks a lot. It's about self-talk and about what we're told. The narratives of talent and genius and things, while there are, of course, the edge cases that are totally true, they do teach us something about how we can't do anything or we're out of control or just kind of give up. There's a lot of narratives baked into those ideas. So the hope chapter was one of the most encouraging in the whole book for me because it really was, hey, if you're going to change, you have to believe you can change. And that's kind of fundamental to, we're always a little discouraged of something we create, and you have to believe that you can make something better if you don't want to give up, essentially, if you want to persevere.
Those are really helpful. I wonder if you could take this here and shift it onto the creative framework for us. Where do we encounter moments that require grit in the creative process? How do we instill that? I think we've got a powerful paradigm or mental model here with the grit framework. What does this look like for the creative? how does this play in our process? If we're even going back to kind of creative first principles of create and revise and share and sustain, where do we see the grittiness? I would love to hear thoughts on that. I'd also hear my inclination is that grittiness is not necessarily opposed to sustaining, right? I think there's a way you can misread grit as something that you're going to burn out with because you're never going to stop, which is, I don't think, the idea. And so maybe two things there. One, what are your initial thoughts on how this plays into the creative process, or maybe even the arc of the project, which we talked about for Cleon before? And then two, what about the possible misreading of this is kind of diametrically opposed to sustaining? I'm going to throw those both your way. You can throw them back, or you can do whatever you want with them.
I think that for the first one, and I don't know if this is an answer to both of them or not, but for that first question, so much of grit is about passion and perseverance for a long-term goal. That's really the core definition. So taking that definition, what does it mean? Break it down a little bit. So the first one is passion and perseverance for, actually, I just want to hone in on the high-level goal part of it. So one of the most helpful parts of the book is where she tells a story of Warren Buffett, famous billionaire investor, owner of Berkshire Hathaway. He was meeting with this businessman and was helping him prioritize some things in his company. And so he said, I want you to write down the top 30 projects on your plate right now, circle 3, and then that list of all the things you didn't circle is what you need to just work as hard as you can to avoid, because it's distracting you, it's keeping you from your goals. And she talks about how she first heard that story and was like, there's no way, like 30 things, who has those? And then she started writing her goals down, and it was like, okay, yeah, 25, 26, 30 is like, okay, yeah, I do have 30 different projects. But the difference is she started to see, and this might have been something I left out of the story just now, that a lot of those goals actually laddered up to 2 or 3 of the same bigger, higher level goals. And so she breaks down a chart. Just imagine a circle in the middle of a page with, some lines coming out the bottom, 2 lines, and then 2 circles, right? So those are your sub goals. And then below those 2 circles, you have 2 or 3 more. Those are your sub goals, right? There's all these levels of tasks that we have. We might have a goal for the day or the week, but then we have a quarterly goal or an annual goal, right? And so the whole idea of perseverance in a long-term goal is, I want to go somewhere as a music producer, but I don't have to hold this tight fist that if I don't finish this one song, that I'm no longer a gritty person. Because grit is not just constantly doing hard things and making yourself miserable. Grit, I think that's sort of the tone that sometimes grit sounds like, just like,
sure,
do whatever sucks and whatever feels really painful and just push through it. And it's going to be a grind.
Because that's got to be good, yeah.
Because it's got to be good for you. Not necessarily. And maybe this is a good time to pitch the book Effortless by Greg McKeown, which is all about why you don't necessarily have to work harder or always take the hard path. But really, grit is about, hey, I chose to go north, and this project turns out it's not going to be possible. I'm too busy. Something came up. It's not inspiring, but there's this other thing. Well, it's really just a question of, is this other thing a shiny object or a rabbit trail that's leading me west? Or is it just a different sort of one of those smaller circles that actually is still heading generally north? Maybe it's northeast, but I'm still moving up.
Yeah.
Like, I think that's the idea that hopefully answers your question, just that grit is about moving in a direction and freeing yourself up from those low-level goals.
Yeah, that's helpful. Do you recall who had the metaphor of putting the big stones in first and then the sand? Is that effortless, or is that a Cal Newport thing?
I think that it's definitely in the book Essentialism, but okay. I think the first time I heard about it was through Art of Manliness, okay. But I don't know. It's probably been around a number of places.
Yeah, that's kind of what came to my mind.
It's very similar, though.
Yeah, of like with the 3 things, of you've got to kind of orientate yourself towards the essentials because I think a lot of times, and it's just kind of what you said, and we've talked about this, all those other things are actually just in service of a couple things, but we act like they're the same weight, like they're weighted the same. But if it was your final grade in a course, like they're not weighted the same. You've got a couple like participation grades that are working you towards a 30% project, but you're treating them like they're all of equal importance, which is just crazy. And once you recognize that, you're like, oh, okay, then things can kind of fall into place. So it's not like, I feel like it's not like you ignore stuff. It's that you put stuff in its right place. And I think by putting stuff in its right place, you allow yourself to get into more meaningful work. Maybe this is where deep work and grit come together in some ways. I don't know. That makes total sense to me. I think it's compelling.
Yeah. There's a story in there too of a New York Times cartoonist who talks about their acceptance rate on the number of submissions they did. Maybe this will be some encouragement for you in the writing realm. They pitched, it was like 3 out of 100 or something, maybe even 1 or 2 out of 100, maybe lower. It was insane. Make 100 cartoons, maybe get 1 to 3 accepted. And I those numbers should be double checked because they were probably too gracious. Like, it was pretty rough. And that really was where she tied in this idea, like, you have to have a direction you want to go if you're going to persevere through something like that. Now, that doesn't mean that you have to finish every single cartoon you start drawing, but it means you have to be comfortable with those years of failure, those submission after submission of failure, because it's not about the little win. It's about the long-term paying off. And there's this great quote she throws in there, an old proverb, fall 7, rise 8. Mm-hmm. That's a great short synopsis of grit. It's just not giving up and persevering. And it doesn't mean it's going to be easy or fun, but just, I think, staying in the game. It's really sustaining. It's really just, it doesn't mean never give up on a specific tiny idea, but it does mean don't throw in the towel, say I'm not a writer anymore, or don't say I'm not a music producer anymore and just give up. That it might be measured more in years and decades than in, days and songs, if you will.
I think it's really well said. And, I'm just reminded with this idea of rejection too, which I just got one the other day. I think it was yesterday or the day before that, right? Oof. It's just I think they become difficult. They're always going to be a little bit of a tinge of like, oh, okay, getting shut down. But one, you've got a rich history of almost every, at least writer that you read about gets tons and tons and tons of rejections. London Steinbeck and Ray Bradbury. Yeah. You just go on and on. Just about everybody's getting rejected. There's some people that are, almost immediate. But what I wanted to get at is you have to have that kind of North Star or that broader orientation to make you stay in the game even with the rejections. So maybe an example might help with, if I write a poem and I can tell that this is a progression in my craft and this is better than what I was writing last year, and I write something that I within my cultivating artistic taste, right? I say, hey, this is something that is good. There's got to be a degree of like pursuing excellence in a craft that even if it's not recognized, there's still a reward. And I think the best artists are often like that. There's a certain confidence that comes from recognizing your work when you're not measuring all your quality by achievement. And I think in sometimes achievement can be super deceptive, right? We've talked about this before. Something successful, we immediately think, oh, it must be of really good quality. Maybe, but maybe not. Something's not successful. Maybe it is now. Maybe you've got a museum named after you, 100 years after your death, like Van Gogh's got, right? It's like achievement can be so fickle. And so you do need some broader pursuits that are of more substance than just recognition. And I think grit's trying to to use that as fuel in some ways. Of like, part of being gritty is taking that passion and taking that perseverance and continuing despite failures in kind of more traditional metrics of success, because oftentimes those metrics of success are measuring the wrong thing.
Mm-hmm. That's well said. I know we need to wrap here. I had 2 more thoughts.
Go for it.
If we could finish up on those. The first one is on the idea of purpose. And side note, I feels like it'd be worth an episode where we, or even a conversation, just sometime of where is that compass going for you and for me? Because I know it's something that I'm wrestling with a lot, and I think it'd be cool to talk through some of those things, because I feel that, tension of like, oh, I could go this way, I could go that way, I could work on this project and this thing, just trying to figure out like what is this stuff all laddering up to, or am I getting pulled 4 different directions? I totally feel that tension right now, and I'd love to talk about it, but
stay tuned.
Yeah. The last 2 thoughts I'll leave you with are, 1, this is a beautiful kind of metaphor for the purpose in your work, and whether that's small or large. And it's a story of 3 bricklayers. The first bricklayer is laying bricks. Someone walks up, hey, what are you doing? I'm laying bricks. They walk up to the second person who's laying bricks and say, hey, what are you doing? I'm building the church. And then the third one walks up to that third bricklayer and says, what are you doing? And he says, I'm building the house of God. And so she talks about this metaphor and how there's always a different lens that we can look at our craft from. And so we might be saying, what are you doing? I'm taking a photo, and you can ladder that all the way up to I'm capturing the human experience, or I'm shedding light on the beauty of this person, or whatever it may be.
Yeah.
There's something deeper that we're always engaging in if we pay attention to it.
So well said.
And I think that's a really beautiful idea from the book.
Yeah, that's totally well said. I think those are the things that are meaningful to us too. And I think there's a quote from G.K. Chesterton where he says, I won't try to actually paraphrase it exactly, but he says basically, you've got love and you've got duty. And when love comes first, and that's the orientating star, right, your duties then find their place. But if duty is the reason why you're doing it and it's not compelled by something else, he's like, it's the worst drudgery. It's just stuff you have to do. And so you have to have that kind of purpose, or that, it doesn't have to be incredibly precise, but I think it does have to be orientating, because if you they have to be in the right order. Otherwise, it's like, yeah, you're just laying bricks. That's really well said.
I love it. So the last thing I'm going to end on is a quote of the week. So at the end of the book, she shares a quote from Ta-Nehisi Coates, and he's a MacArthur Fellow and incredibly renowned writer, and he talked a little bit about his writing process. So we obviously should listen up. And he said, and this is a quote from her, in his 3-minute video posted on the MacArthur website, the first thing Coates says is, failure is probably the most important factor in all of my work. Writing is failure, over and over and over again. And then later she shares a poem that he wrote. It's a description of what it's like for him to write. So I'll just read this. The challenge of writing is to see your horribleness on page, to see your terribleness, and then to go to bed. And wake up the next day and take that horribleness and that terribleness and refine it and make it not so terrible and not so horrible, and then to go to bed again. And come the next day and refine it a little bit more and make it not so bad, and then to go to bed the next day and do it again and make it maybe average, and then one more time, if you're lucky, maybe you get to good. And if you've done that, that's a success. And I think I just thought that was a beautiful summary of how a lot of the creative process, at least for me, is really not sexy and is just making something crappy and then making it a little bit less crappy every time I sit down to work on it. And then after a while, that kind of stacks up to, hey, I kind of like this and I'm ready to share it. And it's so simple, but difficult to do. What do you think about it?
I think that's right on, and that is so in line, or we're in line with it on the our revise, right? So creative first principle, we've talked about this.
Mm-hmm.
The revision process is like sculpting, where you're trying to get more and more detailed, but you can't get there until, right, you get the rough outline, and it's always going to start there. And, the one thing I thought about, and this is something I don't think we've talked about before, in some ways it's a good sign that you recognize that your work's inadequate, because that means to some degree you've got an artistic taste that can see your deficiencies. I think it may be even more scarier when you don't recognize the inadequacy of your work, because then you're kind of taking away the opportunity to grow, right? If there's nothing that you can improve on, or there's nothing that can be taught for you, it's like your growth is done. because you think you've arrived, and your artistic taste is not calibrated how it should. And all the great writers, right? Even the ones like, so Faulkner, when he had, I think it was The Sound and the Fury, he gave it to his editor, and he's like this thing is so good. there's even something like that. He's a writer that recognizes that a lot of what you're writing is not going to be good. Like, he's a craft guy, right? And so even, it's not saying don't have confidence in your work, because I think there is a place to instill confidence. Recognize when you have something good, but if you recognize also your insufficiency in ways, that's not a bad thing. I mean, that could be a good thing. That means you've got your artistic taste is working, and it's distinguishing, and like that should be encouraging, because if you can distinguish what's not working, typically you're halfway there to figuring out what does work.
That's a great note, man. Self-awareness. I love it. Any other thoughts before we wrap?
I'm just looking at the stamp of Faulkner that I've got above my desk. I just kind of looked up and saw. I'm like, oh, he's right there.
Just talking about it. That's amazing. Oh, this was a good episode. Thanks for letting me talk about it, man. It was a great book, and one I hope to revisit and just keep putting into practice, really. So hope it encourages someone else.
Stay tuned for some new content.
Yeah, that's right. We need to tease out. We've got something brewing, something working that'll be coming out in a few weeks. So stay posted. All right. I think that's it. Thanks for listening. Hey, thanks for listening to The Craft with Carter and Colby, where we share what we're learning about the creative process. If you're a writer, music producer, marketer, filmmaker, photographer, or you just love creativity, then this show is for you. Our cover art was designed by Elizabeth Newell. You can learn more about her work at elizabethnewelldesign.com. That's Elizabeth, Newell design.com. And you can follow her on Instagram at ElizabethIsADesigner. If you like the show, there's 3 things you can do to help us out. First, subscribe so you learn when we post new episodes. Second, send the link to one of your friends who you think would enjoy the show. Really, word of mouth is going to be the number one way we grow the show in any way. And 3, if you have a topic you want us to cover, or feedback about how we can improve the show, or comments on what we've said, you can respond to heycraftpodcast@gmail.com, heycraft podcast@gmail.com. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next time.